and I have never felt so angry or ashamed to be a human as I was when I was reading this book. It's really, really affecting. Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Sarah and I love to talk about books. And if you've been watching my channel, you might have noticed that I have been judging the semi-finals for the Booktube Prize, and I will link the Booktube Prize channel in the description below. Now that the results are in for the semi-finals, I can tell you what I thought about the 6 books that I read for the non-fiction category. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through the books in the order that I read them, and then I will tell you how I ranked them and how that compared to the outcome of the semi-final round. Spoiler, my views were a bit different from the final results. So the first book I read was Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And in this book, Wilkerson makes the assertion that not only are the United States incredibly racist, as is plain to see both in history and sadly America's present, but that this racism is part of a wider caste system. For me, at least, that was a new way of looking at an issue which has long upset and angered me. It made a horrifying lot of sense. It draws parallels to the more overt caste system in India, and even evidences how the Nazis looked to America when they were designing their own system of persecution in Germany. Wilkerson's argument is pretty ironclad, and this is probably the best book I've read on the race issue of not just America but the world. It helped me more fully understand the US concept, whilst also seeing the similarities and differences in the racism of my own country, Britain. And Wilkerson makes plain that the issue is far deeper than just skin colour. It's an issue of power, of keeping people in their place and protecting that hierarchy which is topped by those who dictate the narrative for their own gain. Caste is a self-perpetuating structure, as the impacts that are found by those lower down the chain reinforce that narrative that's told to them and about them. And this was a disturbing read for me on many levels, not least the realization that ending inequality isn't simply a case of, not seeing colour, being colourblind, or even being anti-racist. And I guess on that note, the only thing that I didn't like about this book is that it left me feeling powerless. There is a call to arms in the kind of final chapters, can't remember, it's been a while since I read this one, but there isn't like a clear line of action. But I suppose that's not a criticism of the book, it's just my experience of it, because I think bringing this concept into consciousness is more than enough for one book, one author to have achieved. So that is a mantle. Do you grasp a mantle? You grasp something. It has to be grasped by more than one person before change can be meaningfully made. I just wanted a bit more of that from this book, I think. But this is an elegantly written, well-researched book. It's really potent and powerful in its message. It's probably the most impactful and important book that I have read on race and inequality. Then I moved on to Our Bodies, Their Battlefield by Christina Lamb. And this book is a testimonial of the existence and the impact and how far spread the use of sexual assault and rape as a weapon of war is. So Lamb is a war correspondent, so she travels the globe, and in this book that's reflected. She reaches into history to share the stories of the women who aren't just collateral damage or civilian casualties of war, but they are both the enemy's weapon and the deepest victims of conflict that's often started, raged, won, and lost by men. I found this book deeply harrowing. It's a brutal read. At times I had to kind of come up for air and walk away from the horrors that are described on the page. I learned a lot about different conflicts and different peoples and cultures from this book, and that those passages on persecution and inequality, that they served as a welcome break from the descriptions of women's experiences should really tell you something about the rawness and detail that Lamb goes into when she's talking about women's specific sexual assault and rape experiences. The details are not spared and they are not glossed over. And I admit that at times I perceived this as a negative of this book. Maybe that was just a gut reaction, because I understand why she made the decision to write this book as she did and why it's important that these stories are told. I struggled with the level of graphic detail. I'll just be honest about that. But it is all too easy for some people to just in general dismiss rape as a sexual act, as just one of those things that happens, particularly in war, just one of those things that happen when men are away from their own women, they're lonely, they're under incredible amounts of stress, or whatever other excuses are made. And most certainly for some, it's probably easy to argue that it isn't as widespread or as big a deal as the other things that happen in war, such as the loss of property and life. So this evidence, like the accounts in this book, they need to be held up to show that intimacy or release or desperation are the least of the motivations behind, like any rape, but least of all rape in times of war. And that the damage that it causes is far more destructive and longer reaching than other acts of conflict. The power differential alone should tell us that that's the case, but the accounts in this book are of such individual violence and systemic malice that, as hard as it is to read, it does make that argument razor sharp. This is a very important topic to draw attention to because it still continues. Not only are some of the accounts very recent, but the lack of trials or convictions or reparations or even apologies for past atrocities perpetuates the damage and the pain inflicted by this brutal treatment of women, including children. And I have never felt so angry or ashamed to be a human as I was when I was reading this book. It's really, really affecting. So, okay. It's got me riled up again. So I then moved on to the address book by Deirdre Mask. And I'll admit I wasn't sure what I would think about this book going into it. Like I assume quite a few of us do, I've taken having an address for granted and saw it probably merely as a postal or a navigational tool, and I don't really have any interest in urban planning or kind of any similar adjacent sort of subject. But in this book, Mask opened my eyes to the power of addresses and the inequalities inherent in not having one or not having the right sort of one. This book is wide-ranging, from the role of addresses in identifying the cholera outbreak in 1700s London to how like a lack of address for people living in the slums of Kolkata keeps them trapped in poverty. It covers like the history of addresses from their inception to how different cities and different countries approach their address systems. But more than that, this book has got a keen eye on the power dynamics and the political aspect of addresses. And in doing so, Mask has written quite a brilliant social justice book, because I knew that being without a home, and thus being without an address, left people cut off out of, assistance or access to services and safety. And I knew that having like a bad address often tarred people and put up, again, barriers to certain services, support, privilege. But this book goes far deeper into those issues, into areas that I don't think I had been aware of. And it does so in a really accessibly written way, because like this topic could have been much denser and drier and academic in the hands of someone else. But Deirdre Mask makes the topic like endlessly fascinating. Yes, educational, but also like entertaining and moving. So this one really surprised me. I really enjoyed this. And then I moved on to The Dragons, the Giant, the Women by Wayétu, and this is a memoir. So this is Wayétu's memoir of living in and escaping from Liberia during its first civil war in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. She and her family then emigrated to America to escape the conflict and join Wayétu's mother, who was studying over there. And so the memoir examines Wayétu's experience of coming of age in the US as well. What I thought was really interesting about this one is that the narrative pivots on a certain point, so that point being a rebel militia individual. So we see the experience from Wayétu's memory of fleeing as quite a young child. I think she's like 8. And then it pivots and we see it from her mother's experience of being over in America, across the globe, and watching the situation unfurl from the outside without knowing what was going on with her family. And I thought that was really fabulous and made this into quite a page turner. But we also see Wayétu as a young woman with discussions on facing racism in her adopted country as she grew up, and battling with feelings of being untethered, neither of one place or another, and trying to find her home. And I really felt that the book is a thorough portrayal of living through conflict, and how the displacement of people due to such a conflict can inflict kind of further trauma to a person's identity long after even that conflict is over. And I think that's really pertinent as we're watching, the Syrian refugees and other displaced people. This memoir is pretty lyrical. Like it captures the child's view of the experience incredibly well, and that lyricism. Oh, what is wrong with me to say? That lends itself well to like her feelings of turmoil as a young woman. But Wayétu seems to know when to let that style flow and then when to rein it in, which means that there is a clear path through her memoir, which allows you as the reader to take in like the facts of the conflict and what her family were doing in its efforts to stay safe. And it's a pretty seamless blend, and one which I really enjoyed reading. So yeah, I'm probably gonna say that. Well, I should say this about all of them. I really enjoyed it. And then I went on to Lacy Crawford's Notes on Silencing. So Lacy was a student at a prestigious New England boarding school. When at just 15, she was sexually assaulted by 2 older students. And when the school were forced to acknowledge what had happened, they took steps to silence Lacy and basically threatened her education and her reputation. And it was only decades later, when other allegations came out concerning the school and things that had gone on, that she saw evidence to exactly the depths the school had sank in order to protect its own reputation above the safety of the students in its care. So she wrote this memoir to share her experience of both being an assault victim and a victim of a callous cover-up. And I found, like, in this memoir, Lacy is both open and eloquent, which is like key to a good memoir for me. Not only about the abuse that she suffered, but in how it impacted on her sense of self and the changes in her behaviour as she struggled to come to terms with it. The school's like this microclimate which is made toxic by gender, double standards of sexuality, and because it's quite an elite school, this ingrained culture of upholding the outward appearances of like the upper class waspy society. So victim blaming is rife. And this was just among the students. When the school can no longer ignore what has happened to Lacy, this kind of victim blaming becomes amplified in the lack of punishment for the perpetrators and the threatened banishment of Lacy. And I think she captures perfectly the atmosphere and the attitudes of those around her, both as she experienced them as a 15-year-old and then applying kind of the hindsight of her adult years as well. And I found it's just a deeply sad look at how privilege isn't even equal at the higher levels of society when it comes to violence against women, and how the impact of such trauma can manifest itself in ways that simply fuel victim blaming in the eyes of those who refuse to understand that there is no playbook for how someone should behave or how they should handle such an experience. And it also highlights, at least, you know, in this school, how reputation is honored more than even like the safety of children, and the extent to which those in control would go to protect it, and how easy the system makes it for them to do that. So yeah, this is really well written, just desperately sad again. And then I moved on to The Dead Are Rising by Les Payne and Tamara Payne. Jesus, guys, this book is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It includes like nearly 30 years of research that's gone into, so it's a biography of Malcolm X, and it's extensive as those 30 years of research would imply. So it goes from his childhood into his young adulthood and the time that he spent in prison, to them joining and rising in the ranks of the Nation of Islam, and then finally from his expulsion from that sect to his assassination. So this is like the complete story of one of the most prominent figures in the Black rights movement. And I'll be honest, and maybe this is just a product of me being a white person who has lived outside of the US for my whole life, because I'm from the UK, but I have not been particularly familiar with Malcolm X beyond you know, his radical reputation and the fact he was assassinated. I'm far more familiar with Martin Luther King and his non-violent civil rights approach, but you know, even then it's probably not particularly extensive. We didn't learn a lot about it at school. So I was interested to understand this other figurehead, Malcolm X, and what it is that made him such a polarizing name. And so thanks to this book, I now know more than I ever thought I would. There's a lot of like evident factual research, but there's also a range of voices from the people who were closest to Malcolm across his life, and not always necessarily the people that just liked him. So whilst there is a bias towards shining a favourable light on him, I think the authors have done well to point out his kind of less than stellar behaviour, and they do allow a bit of space for the reader to make up their own mind. Because in truth, there was actually a lot about Malcolm that I didn't like from what I read, but I appreciated why he thought the way he did, you know, whether that was because of early life experiences, historical and generational trauma, or the cult-like doctrine that he was unquestionably loyal to in the Nation of Islam. However, what I learned was that at the time of his assassination, it was clear that Malcolm was undergoing a shift in his perspective, which I really do think, would have led him to being at least one of the most important leaders for racial and other equalities we would have ever seen. And his death is devastating, because in that context, it's a loss for the whole world, whilst also being a bit of a coup for those who, even still today, persist in their quite vicious attempts to keep the power in the hands of the white straight man. So yeah, but I did think this book focused more on Malcolm's early life than his impact as the man he became. And it could feel a bit repetitious, is that a word? Repetitive at times. And although there are quotes and letters from Malcolm that were in this, they were quite short and they were quite sparse in the narrative. And I think I would have enjoyed hearing more of Malcolm X's voice in this book. But on the whole, I did think it was quite well presented. It strove for a level of balance, and it was a pretty accessible read. And I'm very glad I read it. So that, I think, yes. So that's all 6 of the books that I read for this round. I ranked the books as follows. So from 6th place to 1st. And I will say, though, it was a really tough call. And on another day, I could have voted differently, as I thought all of the books were of a really high standard. And even the difference between when I ranked them and when I reviewed them, there's differences. So anyway, 6th place, I ranked The Dead Are Arising. I got a lot from this book, but I just thought it was too long and a bit repetitive in places. In 5th place, I went for Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, because I think it's a really important topic, but I think more could have been discussed about the lack of prosecutions and what is being done to break up that barrage of horrors. In 4th place, I've got The Dragons, the Giant, the Women. I thought this was really beautiful and interesting, but sometimes I did get a little bit lost in the lyricism. Yeah. 3rd was Caste, because I thought it was fascinating, a vital argument, but there wasn't enough call to action. So that means in 2nd place, we had Notes on a Silencing. For me, I felt like this was the best written book of the bunch, and I thought that the time that she spent on the aftermath of the assault was honest, and it's important to show how victims do not always respond to such violence in the same way. And so that brings me on to number 1, which was the address book. And like I said, this was my biggest surprise of the bunch, and I honestly found it really fascinating. So only one of my top 3 made it through to the finals, and that was Caste, which I think is fully well deserved. And it's actually joined by my 5th and 6th place rankings, The Dead Are Arising and Our Bodies, Their Battlefields. I wasn't really surprised with the outcome, though, given the topics that those books cover, and I'm not mad, because considering, like I said, it was really hard to rank them. They were all really close, and my opinion wasn't set in stone for any one of them. So I'm really pleased for the books that got through, and I'm glad I read the books that didn't. And so I am switching to fiction for the final, and I'm really excited for the books that I'll be reading for that, given I've already read one and 4 of the other books that made it through were already on my immediate TBR anyway, and then the 6th book sounds really good. So if I find time to read them, I promise I'll make time. I'm in for an amazing experience with those. So if you've been involved in judging any of the rounds of the Booktube final, have you read any of the ones that I did? What were your thoughts on them, and what were your thoughts on the outcome of the semi-final round? And if you haven't read any of these books yet, do you think you'd pick any of them up? I would love to hear your thoughts, so drop me a comment in the box below. And guys, I didn't even really have time to be making this video, so I'm not even going to stick around to chat. I think at the moment I'm just going to have to quit my Wednesday shelf indulgence videos. I do not have time. I am so behind with my uni work. I seem to be having this mental block where I sit down to work and nothing happens, and my deadline is getting ever closer, and I am freaking out about how behind I am. So something's got to give. I'm reading less. I won't be doing my Wednesday videos. There might be some Saturdays where I don't even get a Saturday video up. I really hope you will stick by me while I go through this. It's only until the start of September, and then I will get my life back, I will get my reading back, and I will get my channel back on track, I swear. So if you do stick by me, thank you so much. And if you don't, maybe you'll find me again at some point in the future. But until, I was going to say next week, hopefully next week. Let's manage expectations here, dudes. The only thing I've got to say before I go off and do some more trawling through academic journals and trying to make sense of an argument is bye.